Hi guys, so the video I did on Cheikh Anta Diop is well past 1000 likes, and that was amazing to see guys. I didn't expect that video to do so well so fast. Thank you guys are the best. I am so grateful to all of you out there who saw fit to respond to my jokingly request. So finally guys, I get to bring to you the debate that restored ancient Egypt to what it was, an ancient African civilization in all sense of the word. This view of ancient Egypt not being part of Africa had been embraced since the late 1800s, but this debate came to set things to right once again. I am here referring to the 1974 Cairo Symposium on the peopling of ancient Egypt. This video is going to be long, people, since it is a scholarly debate, right, as you would expect. So I will have to divide it into parts. I would not want to be accused of misrepresentation, therefore each scholar's statement will be read in full as reported in the UNESCO Symposium report. So folks, brace for it. This debate is full of interesting arguments, and by interesting I mean very interesting, and funny comments. So I hope you will have as much fun watching this as I did while making this. So with that said, let's jump into the video. Alright guys, first I would like to explain how this is going to go. This project will be divided into several parts as I said previously. In each part, I am going to present statements made by each participant as written in the report and add my own commentary if necessary. And for those who would doubt the authenticity of my work, there is a link in the description where you can find the report of this symposium freely available. Isn't that amazing? No need to buy the book. UNESCO has the whole thing available for free on its website. So go check the description below for the link to the report of the symposium. It's freely available. I mean, you can actually Google it. You can just type on Google UNESCO Symposium 1974 or Cairo Symposium 1974 and you will get to find it there on the UNESCO website for free. Also, for those who might want to know if there are any tapes of the symposium, let me tell you that there are no tapes or audios available for the whole debate. All we have is a 30-minute recording of Diop presenting his evidence during the debate. Apart from that, I am not aware of any other recordings, and I looked for them, trust me. I still didn't find the rest of the debate. Professor Nusere Kalala Omotunde, who once personally worked with UNESCO, stated that he asked UNESCO for the tapes or audios of the symposium, and they claimed that they weren't available. And for the record, people, this isn't normal. Usually such things are taped and recorded, but since this debate went the way it did, some people have chosen to hide the tapes and act as if it never happened. Yes, I did say some people. I shall name no one. You do the guesswork yourself. Nevertheless, one cannot make everything disappear. We know it happened, and fortunately, we have this report from the UNESCO to read and reread. So yeah, that's something. Alright, enough talking from me, let's start. Annex to Chapter 1, Report of the Symposium of the Peopling of Ancient Egypt and the Deciphering of the Meroitic Script. Cairo, January 28th to February 3rd, 1974. Summary report. The symposium was held in two stages. The first took place from the 20th to the 31st of January 1974 and concerned the peopling of ancient Egypt. The second dealt with the deciphering of the Meroitic script and took place from the 1st of February to the 3rd of February 1974. The participants were as follows. I'm gonna butcher some names here, so bear with me. Professor Abdelgadir M. Abdallah from Sudan. Professor Abou Bakar, Arab Republic of Egypt. Mrs. Anne Blanc, France. Professor F. de Bono, Malta. Professor J. Davis, France. Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, Senegal. Professor Galab, Arab Republic of Egypt. Professor El Habachi, Arab Republic of Egypt. Professor R. Holt Other, Professor R. Holt Zor, whatever this name is, Finland. Mrs. J. Gordon Jacquet, or Jacket, United States of America. Professor S. Hussein, Arab Republic of Egypt. Professor Kaiser, Federal Republic of Germany. Yeah, that sounded like a German name. Professor J. Leclon, France. Professor G. Mokhtar, Arab Republic of Egypt. Professor R. L. Nadouri, Arab Republic of Egypt. Professor Théophile Benga, People's Republic of the Congo. Professor S. Soneron, France. Professor T. Savage Soderberg, or Soderberg. Professor T. Savage Soderberg, Sweden. Professor P. L. Shiny, Canada. Oh, we got a shiny person here. Or is it Shiny? Whatever the name is. Professor J. Vercouteur, or Professor J. Vercouteur, as the French would say, France. There were some other participants who were supposed to be here but couldn't attend and sent their apologies. UNESCO was represented by Mr. Maurice Glele, Program Specialist, Division of Cultural Studies, representing the Director General, and Mrs. Monique Melser, Division of Cultural Studies. 2. The present report is an unabridged version of the final report of the symposium. It was prepared by the International Scientific Committee's rapporteur at the request of the committee for insertion in this volume. The proceedings of the symposium have been published in the series The General History of Africa, Studies and Documents Number 1, UNESCO, Paris, 1978. Right, so for those out there who might think that this symposium was an invention by Diop, you are clearly proven wrong by these introductory statements. This debate was organized by the International Scientific Committee's rapporteur at the request of the Committee of UNESCO. So we are on scientific grounds here. All claims that Diop is an imposter and not a scientist or a historian, or as some called him, a pseudo-historian, and that pseudo-historian gives Africa a mythical past, are simply baseless, dishonest, and wrong, and these statements from UNESCO prove it. But what is coming will put to rest all such claims made by his detractors. Let's continue. Here is an outline of the symposium. 2 papers previously commissioned by UNESCO from Professor Gilles Vercouteur and Mrs. Anne Blanc provided a basis for discussion. 3 important stages may be distinguished in the discussion. A. Summary of the introductory papers. B. Preliminary statements made by most of the participants. C. General discussion. In this video, we're going to focus on Part A and the first half of Part B. Part A. Summary of the introductory papers. Professor Vercouteur. Professor Vercouteur drew attention to a number of points dealt with in greater detail in his written report and made a number of further observations. A. In spite of recent progress, physical anthropology had so far provided relatively little reliable data except in Nubia. The information available was insufficient to enable provisional conclusions to be drawn with regard to the peopling of ancient Egypt and the successive phases through which it may have passed. Furthermore, this information was not homogeneous as regarded either time or space, and historians often disagreed as to how it should be interpreted. The methods themselves were being called into question, but it was now generally agreed that craniometry did not meet the requirements of such research. A number of regions had still not been studied in depth. This applied to the interior delta during the pre-dynastic and proto-dynastic periods, and to Upper Egypt prior to Neolithic times. Little was known of the area between the 2nd and 6th cataracts in Neolithic and proto-dynastic times. Similarly, the links existing in ancient times between the Sahara, Darfur, and the Nile had as yet been very little studied. In that respect, the work that had been done lagged behind what had been achieved in North Africa and in the Syria-Palestine zone. Evidence at present available did not warrant the assertion that the populations of northern Egypt had been different from those in the south. Similarly, the gap between Paleolithic and Neolithic was probably due to the fact that insufficient research had yet been done in that field. Vercouteur, yes, craniometrics was flawed, but craniofacial anthropometry, which is an improved version of craniometrics and more reliable, was what was used to determine the race of the ancient Egyptians. Diop had referred to some studies done by certain anthropometrists. Though they tried to trick the indices, the method was reliable enough. It wasn't the old craniometrics that was used there, which focused more on brain size and skull. It was the much better improved version of craniofacial metrics, which focuses more on facial indices along with overall skull shape that were used to determine race. And by the way, craniofacial metrics are still in use today in various fields such as physical anthropology, modern forensic anthropology, paleoanthropology, etc. All in order to determine someone's identity, ethnicity, and race. You can determine sex through that, you can determine race through that, you can determine a bunch of things by observing someone's bones alone. That is an undeniable fact. You can even distinguish the races. That is an undeniable fact. So guys, here's the thing with craniometrics. You have to be careful with these terms. When someone says craniometrics, what do they mean? There was the old craniometrics that was focused on brain size and skull size. Those craniometrics used to believe that the races had different brain size, proving the superiority of the white race over other races. So to do that, some racist doctor from America, I believe, was measuring brain size and said, yeah, there is a difference between the races, but other peer studies proved that his study was bogus. It was bullshit. So that was the old craniometrics. They were like, brain size can tell us race. That was nonsense. Now, there is an improved version of craniometrics that does not measure brain size. They were like, brain size does not tell us race. It's bullshit that races have different brain size. So they started focusing on facial features. People still realized that races did look different. You know, certain people looked very different from one another, and that came from bone structure. So they started measuring facial indices. By that we mean they started measuring the orbital shape, that is where your eyes are located in your bones, and it differs from race to race. If you look at a skull from the profile, Africans often have a prognathosum. That means their mouth often goes forward. The nose index is often wide for Africans and not wide for Caucasians. So things like that. That is what they measure in today's craniometrics. And even at the time of this debate, those craniometrics were already in use. That's why we call them craniofacial anthropometrics, to distinguish from the old craniometrics. That old nonsense of brain size. So it is a bit disingenuous to be like, well, craniometrics hadn't done anything. Then you are not aware of all the studies that had already been done, that Diop mentioned in his book that he wrote prior to this symposium. Clearly they didn't read Diop. Clearly they didn't read those studies. They just thought,
some of these craniometric studies are coming with some crazy stuff. I mean, they're finding Negroes in Egypt. How crazy is that?
that's probably why they thought it was so unreliable, because they saw an African skull and they couldn't fathom it. Like,
no man, how can an African skull be in a place with civilization? I mean, these Africans have no civilization. I mean, they don't even have the brain to conceptualize such things as mathematics.
Ishango Bone.
So how come they are here?
That's because they lived there.
Now, craniometrics must be unreliable. We can't rely on it. We just can't rely on it.
Meanwhile, when the skull is European...
Oh yes, craniometrics is indeed reliable in this specific case.
Well, let's continue. Just a little rant there, a little tangent. Let's continue.
B. Insufficient and unsatisfactory use had been made of iconography. The studies which had been carried out were based mainly on cultural criteria. The iconographic material available, however, has extremely significant characteristics from the 18th dynasty onwards.
Now, this here is some serious BS. They don't say the same thing about Mesopotamian or Greek iconography. By iconography, we mean paintings and statues, right? The drawings people leave about themselves. But for the Egyptians, somehow the iconography is not reliable. Crookery. I call that crookery. The iconography was characteristic even before the 18th dynasty, and I can prove it. I will make a video on pharaohs from the 1st dynasty to the 30th dynasty to show how their iconography was already significant even back then, to disprove this claim that I still hear today. Well, you know, the pharaohs look white before the 18th dynasty. What? Look at Mentuhotep. Does he look white to you? Jesus Christ. Let me know if you would like a video going through all the pharaohs, not all of them, of course, going through pharaohs from dynasty 1st to the 30th dynasty, and we're just gonna look at their iconography and see what features are represented there. That would be fun. Let me know in the comment section. Alright, now here is a summary of the opposing theories. Please hold your jaw so that it does not drop. I have warned you.
Outline of the two opposing theories in their most extreme form. 1. The people who lived in ancient Egypt were, quote, white, even though their pigmentation was dark or even black as early as the pre-dynastic period. Negroes made their appearance only from the 18th dynasty onwards. From the proto-dynastic period onwards, according to some, the population remained the same. Others believed that foreign penetration into Africa profoundly altered the conditions of cultural life.
So that was the theory of Western and Asian scholars in its most extreme form. I did warn you to hold your jaw. Lol, that is extreme indeed. White even if the skin is black. So we have a black white person, a circle with corners, right? That makes sense to these guys. An oval square makes sense. A triangle with 4 sides, that makes sense, man. It was a triangle even if it had 4 sides. It was a circle even if it had 3 corners. Okay, what did you smoke, bro? Like, what are you using? Give us some. We need it to see the world the way you do. I mean, if I start seeing I see black people, but I call them white because, you know, because they built a pyramid. No, they're white. This is completely ridiculous and extreme even for back then. They said this was an extreme form of this, and it was indeed. But hey, they were just quoting their founding father, Champollion Figeac, who said, black skin and woolly hair are not characteristic of the black race. The ancient Egyptians were white with dark or even black skin. That's Champollion. This is not a new view. This appeared in the 1800s where people started seeing white people who have woolly hair and black skin. For these guys, one could look like Idris Elba and they would still not call them black. Why? Because they were from ancient Egypt. Oh, that's nonsense, man. That is nonsense. And also this idea that Africa got its civilization from some group of Eurasians that came into Africa is simply a false one. There is no evidence that supports this view. There are studies that demonstrate that ancient Egypt was developed indigenously with little to no outside influence, and so did many other African civilizations. Alright, now let's take a look at Diop and Obenga's extreme claim.
2. Ancient Egypt was peopled from its Neolithic infancy to the end of the native dynasties by black Africans.
Extreme stuff, right? Now we know what they called extreme in the case of African scholars, claiming that black people lived in ancient Egypt from the beginning to the end of its native dynasties was extreme to these people. Jesus Christ. We can really say they really had the racist model of the Gobino and this other clown from, I think, Finland or Sweden there. I don't know. And the model went something like this.
The whites, civilized. The yellow, semi-civilized. The black, uncivilized.
So, these people who believed this could not possibly fathom. They had been taught that the black was uncivilized. He was a savage. He had no kings. He had no society. He had nothing to show for scientifically or anything. Now, what happens when you have honest scholars who go over there and look at the African societies with no bias and find evidence for complex mathematical science, complex construction, complex architecture, complex political systems that rivaled and were even superior to that of Europe in medieval time? How do you reconcile that? You know, you've been taught all your life that these Africans, they are savages. They can't build any civilization. It's nature. It's just a fact of nature. But then you're confronted with something that shatters your worldview. So what do? They start tripping, lying, and calling it extreme. They could not possibly fathom this fact. Black Africans responsible for humanity's earliest civilization? Impossible. That's like claiming a black-white person or a four-sided circle. An impossibility. I told you this debate was funny. Imagine arguing with people who can conceive such impossibilities as a three-sided square or a four-sided triangle. It's quite difficult. You gotta give it to Diop and Obenga to have had to sit through this. You know, imagine debating this. Oh man. Alright. Actually, one thing you must know is that Diop and Obenga's extreme statement, extreme theory there is now an undeniable fact. All studies on pre-dynastic mummies, early dynastic mummies, Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, Intermediate Period mummies all find black Africans in ancient Egypt. That's not even mentioning the iconography that scholars like to dismiss for no valid reasons. Alright guys, let's move on to Mrs. Blanc.
Mrs. Blanc. A. mindful of the fact that, for reasons which were themselves historical, the historiography of the valleys of the Nile had been based on the assumption that there were a civilized Egyptian valley providing a wealth of historical evidence and another valley further south which was black and primitive and of interest only to anthropologists. Mrs. Blanc hoped that historical research in the valley as a whole would in future be more balanced. This would mean abandoning traditional historical methods and broadening the field of inquiry to embrace a new methodology. Mrs. Blanc saw the work which had been going on in Nubia for the last 20 years or so as a first step toward the re-examination of the question which faced the symposium.
Hey, kudos to Mrs. Blanc. What she points out there is true. The Western scholars had this assumption that only Egypt was civilized and the rest of Africa wasn't, right? So you have Egypt civilized and the rest of Africa primitive. An ignorant assumption. This assumption exposes itself as especially ignorant and ludicrous in the case of Nubia, where the scholars treat it as primitive or as an extension of ancient Egypt in spite of the wealth of archaeological documents found there. They are here debating on the Meroitic script. Where do you think that is? That's a written language invented by Nubians, but somehow...
Well, they're primitive.
This subject needs a video on its own, and you guessed it, I'm gonna do a video series on it too. There's plenty of archaeological evidence that suggests Nubia was older than Egypt and that the religion of the Egyptians originated there. I mean, for them to ignore this is simply bad faith or ignorant at best. Mrs. Blanc continues.
B. In order to escape from the traditional view of the Nile Valley, which traced its historical development in a north-south direction, from the quote more civilized to the quote less civilized, Mrs. Blanc drew attention to the Nile regions situated between the 23rd parallel and the sources of the river in Uganda. Her analysis took into account the dividing line as being of fundamental ecological importance, along with the 10th parallel where the advance of Islam stopped. Between the 23rd and the 10th parallel, the Nile, being a navigable waterway, could apparently have played a role comparable to that which it played further north in Egypt. This did not occur, and the ecological conditions in this reach of the river no doubt provided a principal explanation.
That traditional view of the north-south direction of the origin of Kemet was a forced one. No evidence supported that view then, and certainly not today. The overwhelming amount of evidence supports a south to north direction of the diffusion of ancient Nile Valley civilization. This is undeniable today, at least to serious scholars, not to those who can conceive things such as a white-black person or a four-sided circle. Dynastic Kemet, that is ancient Egypt, was originated by the Nakda people who came from Upper Kemet and Lower Tasseti. For those who are unaware of those terms, Kemet equals Egypt and Tasseti equals Nubia. A video on the originators of Kemet is in the works. Press the subscribe button if you want to watch that future video.
Mrs. Blanc went on to make an overall examination in the light of this fact of the respective contributions of settled and nomadic populations throughout the area considered. But after tracing the history of the population changes since the coming of the Muslim Arabs, she concentrated particularly on reviewing hypotheses concerning the peopling of this zone prior to their arrival. She emphasized that the Nile Valley facilitated communication with West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and that it was reasonable to put forward the hypothesis that the civilizations which emerged there might be authentically African rather than civilizations intermediate between the Mediterranean world and Black Africa. Darfur to the west, about the social and political organization of which, prior to the 17th century, little is known, nevertheless played an important part as a regional center of economic development. To the east, the regions of Sennar, inhabited by the Funj or the Funj, was the center of a black sultanate, which was originally neither Arab nor Muslim.
Hey, you gotta give some credit to this Mrs. Blanc. She's an unbiased, critical scholar. We gotta give credit to such people, you know? It's really great to see this. Then she went on to claim that some other regions in and around the Nile Valley needed further study, and that the only regions that had been thoroughly historically investigated were regions further south in East Africa. So that is all for part A. Now on to part B. Part B. Preliminary statements by participants. We start with a statement from Professor Soderberg.
Professor Save Soderberg gave information about the Scandinavian excavations in the Sudan between 1960 and 1964. These excavations established that there were contacts between the Nile Valley and North Africa and the Sahara. The subjects covered by the publications included 70,000 rock drawings and the analysis of the remains of 1,546 human individuals. Van Nielsen Volume 9 had defined the relations between the A group, C group, New Kingdom group, and etc. Comparative studies yielded different results, depending on whether craniometry only was used or anthropological and technological factors as a whole. Iconographical and physical anthropology studies lent support to the idea that there had been a migration of Saharan peoples and of groups coming from the south, and that they also had considerable contact with the ancient Egyptians. For the Mesolithic period, comparisons had to be made on the basis of fewer than 100 skeletons. Valid conclusions were impossible in the case of Nubia, but more accurate data could be obtained on the Neolithic period. In any event, Professor Save Soderberg thought that it was impossible to base a study of the peopling of Egypt in ancient times or any other similar study on racial distinctions. In future, other lines of inquiry should be followed. Different cultures contemporary with one another but isolated might nevertheless belong to the same technocomplex. This new method confirmed that Egypt was African. But if one looked beyond this finding, it was apparent that there were many other problems. Nagda 1 and 2 did not belong to the same technocomplex as Nubia or the contemporary Sudan. In the Sudan, the zone extending from Kassala to Chad and from Wadi Halfa to Khartoum was a single large technocomplex unit. The A group constituted another and more recent technocomplex between the first and third cataracts and possibly beyond.
It is impossible to base a study of the peopling in ancient Egypt on racial distinctions. That is clearly false. Just a way to run away from the facts at hand. No one reasonable would agree with this. One can indeed do studies on racial distinctions of ancient peoples of Egypt. Such studies had been done then, and they are being done now. It's funny how such things are not said about Mesopotamia or ancient Greece, right? We all just assume they were white. I mean, studies are being done to ascertain whether they were white, but the assumption is that they were white. So his view there is just nonsensical and false. And you notice that he stated that Kemet, that is ancient Egypt, was African in terms of its technocomplex, which means that the technology the ancient Egyptians were using was a similar technology to that of other Africans. Anyhow, on to the next participant, the one and only Professor Cheikh Anta Diop.
Professor Cheikh Anta Diop gave an extensive account of his ideas. He summarized a written paper picking out the main points. A. From the anthropological point of view, research carried out since the discoveries of Professor Leakey led to the conclusion that the human race first came into existence in Africa in the region of the source of the Nile. Glauber's law, which presumably applied just as much to the human race as the other species, stated that warm-blooded animals which evolved in a warm, humid climate had a dark eumelanin pigmentation. The earliest human beings on Earth were therefore ethnically homogeneous and negroid. The population spread out from this original area, reaching other regions of the Earth by only two routes, the Nile Valley and the Sahara. In the Nile Valley, this spread in a northerly direction in a progressive movement between the Upper Paleolithic and the Protohistoric period. Even Professor Masular had reached the conclusion that the population of ancient Egypt perhaps comprised at least three different racial elements: Negroids, amounting to over 1/3 of the total, Mediterranean people, and people of the Cro-Magnon type. Professor Diop inferred from this that the population of Egypt was basically Negro during the pre-dynastic period, a conclusion contradicting the theory that the Negro element spread to Egypt in later times. Skeletons with fragments of skin attached, dating from very ancient times before the practice of mummification was introduced, had been discovered by Elliot Smith. These fragments, stated Professor Diop, contain melanin in sufficient quantity to establish them as Negro skin. In the quest for positive proof, Professor Diop had studied a number of preparations being subjected to laboratory examination in Dakar. These consisted of samples of skin taken from mummies found in Mariette's excavation. Egyptians. They all revealed, and Professor Diop invited the specialist present to examine the samples, the presence of a considerable quantity of melanin between the epidermis and the dermis. Melanin, which was not present in white skin, persisted for millions of years, notwithstanding frequent affirmations to the contrary, as could be seen from an examination of the skins of fossil animals. Professor Diop hoped to be given the opportunity of carrying out similar research on the skins of the pharaohs whose mummies were in the Cairo Museum collection. He went on to state that a conclusive anthropological study would also include osteological measurements and the study of blood groups. It was remarkable, for example, that present-day Egyptians, particularly in Upper Egypt, belonged to the same blood group B as the populations of West Africa and not to group A, which was characteristic of the white race. B. Iconography. On the basis of an important iconographical drawing and the definitions given in this work, Professor Diop contended that it was unnecessary to dwell on details which, for example, distinguished Negroes from other personages, the latter being aristocratic in the same tomb. This difference of representation was of social origin. The common people were iconographically distinguished from members of the ruling class. C. Professor Diop went on to speak on the evidence provided by ancient written sources, pointing out that Greek and Latin authors described the Egyptians as Negroes. He referred to the testimonies of Herodotus, Aristotle, Lucian, Apollodorus, Aeschylus, Achilles Statius, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Diogenes Laertius, and Ammianus Marcellinus. Modern scholars, he said, refused to take account of those texts. By contrast, an 18th century author, Volney, did speak of the inhabitants of ancient Egypt as Negroes. Furthermore, the biblical tradition also considered Egypt as belonging to the descendants of Ham. Professor Diop considered that the science of Egyptology, a product of imperialism, had much to answer for in denying all the facts to which he had just referred. D. Professor Diop then turned his attention to the way in which the Egyptians described themselves. They used only one word for this purpose, kemet, quote, the strongest term existing in the language of the pharaohs to indicate blackness, which was translated by Professor Diop as the Negroes. Consequently, this hieroglyph was not written with crocodile scales, but with a piece of charcoal.
Now that was fire. Diop did not come here to play. His statement was lengthy yet brief enough, concise, and very informative at the same time. It was so organized. That is a display of thorough research and organization of his evidence. I understand why UNESCO praised him in the end. Now, on the melanin test, someone claimed in my comment section that the study Diop conducted on the mummies was bogus. That is simply a false notion spread by his detractors who can't face the facts he brought. Melanin, specifically eumelanin, which is responsible for pigmentation in various animals and humans, is indeed preserved for millions of years in fossils. They can still trace it. It's a fact. Inasmuch as the other participants were denying this fact, the notion of eumelanin or melanin preservation in fossils is now a fact. Here are some studies you can look up for this. They all claim, yes, melanin is indeed preserved in fossils. So if eumelanin can be preserved in fossils for millions of years, it definitely can be preserved in human remains that are only a few thousands of years old. And Diop proved it. Diop stated it was a myth, which it was. Everyone knew that it was a myth that fossils did not preserve melanin. They all thought fossils did not really preserve melanin. But today, with modern science, we do know they preserve melanin, and Diop knew that then. The other scholars only believed it was impossible, even though they hadn't tried to get such a study done themselves. In any case, here is a study that supports Diop's claim on the fossils, and several others that do support this as well. Now that is for fossils, right? What about humans? Is there any other study that supports what Diop claimed there, that you could actually calculate the quantity of melanin in the skin of humans? Yes, there is. There is a study by Shosuke Ito and Wakamatsu that was done in 2003 that confirmed that one could indeed measure the quantity of melanin in the skin of humans. And that the quantity of melanin, specifically eumelanin, in the skin was what determined the coloration of the skin of the epidermis. So again, high melanin quantity means your complexion is brown, dark brown, or black, like the tropical Africans or the Melanesians or the Negritos or all these other peoples that are dark in complexion. So again, another recent study that confirms Diop's findings, and they dared call him a fraud. Some people have no shame at all, really, no shame. Also, the ancient testimonies are indeed ignored by modern scholars to this day. As Diop said there, they have a lot to answer for, but they don't. They keep bringing this narrative forward. The mainstream narrative is that there is only one ancient testimony that mentions that the Egyptians had dark skin, and they say it's Melanchrois. No. There is plenty. As Diop just pointed out, he's mentioned how many? 10? But only one is addressed? Watch my video on the ancient testimonies. I put it up on YouTube with, I think, 7 testimonies up there, all claiming the Egyptians were black. Egyptologists simply choose to ignore these facts. They only addressed one. That's simply dishonest. That's not how you do scientific work. How can you ignore first-hand accounts? At least trust me, I was there. And you come and tell me that I didn't know what I was seeing. A simple effing description. At least we can trust people on what they saw, especially when it comes to humans. Can he fail to describe human beings? Your hair is crinkly, your skin is dark, your lips are protruding. How can you ignore first-hand accounts, first-hand descriptions? Yet the same people are ready to believe Homer on the Trojan War, and they're ready to believe Plato on Atlantis. Simply dishonest. You can believe Plato on Atlantis, but you can't believe Herodotus, Ammianus Marcellinus, Lucian of Samosata, and all these others, Diodorus Siculus, on a simple description of something they saw. But Homer talks about the Trojan War. It happened. Plato refers to Atlantis, the gardens of Babylon. Yeah, it was all there. Where's the evidence? We don't know, but it was there. Simply dishonest. That is utterly intellectually dishonest. Diop has also just suggested some studies that could be done to determine the race of the ancient Egyptians, but of course they didn't listen, because they know that if they do such unbiased studies, they are bound to find out that ancient Egypt had a majority black population. Diop asked to study the skin of the mummies at the Cairo Museum, but the Egyptian government refused to give them. I mean, they never answered. Diop claimed they never answered. But that's a way to refuse. Why not answer? He is a scholar, a renowned scholar. Why not give him? Why? The study is not invasive. All Diop needed was a square millimeter. Why deny him? And this wasn't the last time the Egyptian government refused to analyze mummies that might be black. Here is something to back my claims. I don't know if you've seen the Egyptian nobleman that was found to be black, to the disappointment of the research team. The video went viral, it was very popular. I think you can type on YouTube, "Researcher disappointed that Egyptian mummy was black." Well, the name of the mummy that was being investigated was Shemai, and Shemai was a nobleman in ancient Egypt. Now, was Shemai alone? Did he have a family? Was he married? Well, it just so happens that Shemai was part of a large family of 14 members, and they are all in the Cairo Museum. Oh yes, but the government declined further study on them. Typical of the Egyptian government there. Why deny the study? Why deny the further study? I bet if those mummies were found to be of Arabic origin or Mediterranean origin, the study wouldn't have been denied. Study further. I mean, can you map the whole genome? But for this Shemai guy who was found to be black, they're like, no, stop right here. He's the only one in his family that we're going to study anyways. And they would say that Diop is not scientific. Lol. How dare you? There is a link in the description to the full article on this situation. There, the scientific team asked the government if they could investigate the other family members of Shemai. The government declined. Anyhow, we'll stop here for this video. This has been fun, guys. See you in part 2 of the Cairo Symposium with more preliminary statements. It is coming soon, so stay tuned, subscribe to my channel, and if you liked this video, please like, share, and comment. I would really appreciate that. And as always, thanks for watching. Peace.